Boom. Getting connected. 1, 2, 3, and can we get the fourth platform connected? Come on, come on, you can do it. I believe in you. Yeah. All right, we are connecting on all four platforms. We already got a viewer. Go ahead and say hello in the chat. 2 people. Say hello, hello. We got a special guest on. We're gonna maybe give it like another minute or so. 3 people. Yeah, say hello. We got special guests on today. Gonna be having a really cool conversation, talking about all sorts of cool stuff. But I'm really excited. I think this is gonna be a fun time. Okay, cool. Well, I'm just gonna say. So this is John. Jonathan, you go by Jonathan. What do you go by?
Jonathan is probably usually easier, yeah.
Jonathan. All right. So this is Jonathan. He is. You said moderator for Answers to Everything, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And so he and I have been having some exchanges on Twitter recently, and just kind of at the last minute, we decided to throw this together and get him on, which I love. You guys know I do that all the time. I love getting to meet new people and see where their heads are at and what they're thinking about. And kind of the thing that we were focused on, and this is just where we'll start. We'll see where it goes from there. But like, what is a right? Right? Like, what are human rights? What is like the definition, the interpretation, kind of the history of it? And so I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had because that actually stemmed from. I did a little Twitter poll. I was like, if you were for a U.S. citizen, voting in U.S. governmental elections is and then privilege or right. Those are the 2 options, and so that's where this kind of stemmed from. But I'd love to pass it off to you, Jonathan, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit more, say something else about Answers to Everything, or where your head's at, or what you were thinking about today, or what you're interested in. It's a pretty free form and open, so go for it.
Well, good. Thank you, Sass. There's lots of things I could say about rights, and I'd like to say start a little bit of introduction about the Answers to Everything project. Um, I'm the founding chair of a group we call the Harmony Research Group. We organized ourselves back in the mid 1990s. Around 1995, I was looking around to see if there. I looked in the library to see if was there any agenda anywhere, a nonpartisan agenda, which had proposed solutions for all of the political, economic, and social problems facing America today. Only thing I could find were some statements by various political parties, but even those were fairly limited in scope. And I couldn't find anything really nonpartisan and nothing really comprehensive about everything. So I figured, okay, well, it doesn't seem to exist anywhere. Why not just make one? Why not be the first people if we actually are? And since that time, I've continued to look around for any, and now we have all the internet and all the social media and everything at our disposal. And still, with all that, I still have not been able to find anywhere where any individual or group has assembled any kind of proposal that purports or attempts to cover all of our political, economic, and social topics, showing how they all interrelate and how you can't really properly consider a solution in one area without considering how it might impact another area and how the other area might impact might impact it. So I felt that we needed some kind of an approach which looked at all of these topics taken together and see how they all interrelate and make sure that we cover everything. And I still haven't found anyone else who's done that. So in '95, I formed, as I said, this group called the Harmony Research Group, and we gave ourselves this mission to create this agenda, which didn't seem to exist anywhere else, and see what might be able to happen with it. So once we got that going, I put together a list, an outline of questions that we would start asking. Had about 800 questions to start with. And then the panel, we formed some discussion panels to go over them. And the panels added more questions over time. We've probably got a couple of thousand questions by now. We're still working on finalizing the agenda. We've done a lot of work on it since then. And one of the early questions that our panels dealt with was, what is a right? Because there's all this discussion about there might be different kinds of rights, there might be different sources of rights, Are some people entitled to rights and some are not, and under what conditions, and everything? Do rights carry certain responsibilities? Is someone who has a right, are they entitled to waive that right? And if so, under what conditions, if any? And there's all these questions about rights, but we can't seem to find a basic, short, concise definition of what a right actually is. And we introduced this topic to our panels. We first did it. I was going over in preparation for our meeting today. I went over our notes from when our panels treated this topic. And one panel, the only one who we formed a total of 4 panels, and only one panel had made it all the way through our agenda without giving up. So that's the main source of our model now. And that model, that panel considered this question in 1997, and that was an in-person panel, and I recorded. If we want to go over some of these, we don't have to go over all of them, but they came up with a bunch of different possible definitions. Some of them were shorter, and some were longer. Some were vague, some were circular, and a lot of them depended on the meaning of other terms. Like we would say. Well,
let me pause you before
yeah.
I want to get into this list. But I just want to respond to a couple things you've already said. Your kind of initial thing of like who has put together like a comprehensive plan of like all of it, and like what are the, and I just pushed out a big update to my website this morning that really like clarified and put forward like kind of my version of that. There's still more issues that I have to address, but so I'll just highlight it real quick. So my platform has 4 pillars: universal basic income, voting method reform, government accountability, and directly addressing division. I find these as like the 4 central things, and there needs to be further discussion and defining of them to really understand them. But at least in the U.S., of like, these are the big things that we needed to address that are in the way of us getting to anything else. And then from there, it's policy stances on things like healthcare and the environment and stuff. But like, none of that is going to happen until these kind of core issues are addressed. That like people are out of survival mode and not in subject to scarcity mentality anymore, so that way their minds are actually able to address these bigger, longer term problems. And that's unconditional basic income. It's voting method reform, of course, is very technical, unintuitive science about like it's not about majority, it's about building consensus. It's about like how it's about increasing the power of the vote. Government accountability is like, this needs to come from the people, and I'm working on building a platform that builds a quantifiable, continuous public feedback loop that's actually like very interactive and getting the information directly in front of people rather than just waiting for them to come to it. And then directly addressing division is just looking at some of the systemic issues that we see with our media. And more thinking about like, all right, well, this is a result of centuries of broken mechanics, and we can fix some of those mechanics, but we also have like a lot of very immediate problems, and so we can fix some of those with things like separating news and opinion, applying fairness doctrine to opinion, and decoupling news from the profit motive through things like journalism vouchers. And so it's kind of like getting these core things, gets the government to align its actions with the needs and desires of the people, which is necessary. Wealthy governments around the world need to have sustainable action to address some of these much larger issues like climate change, and that's going to require that kind of responsiveness. So if and when you have an opportunity, I'd love for you to go through and see some of the updates on my site. But of course, I will always be adding more. And then I'll just quickly give kind of my bigger, broader definition of a right, and then I'd love to go into your list. So the way I like to describe a right in a very like layman's terms, like simple way, is a human right is like, so if you have like this thing that like definitively makes people's lives better, and it could be whatever thing you want it to be, healthcare, food, housing, whatever, doesn't matter. And you get to a point in society, or at least in your country or your region, where you have this thing in enough abundance that that society is then able to just guarantee it for everybody. And so then that collective of people decides, just because they can, that they are now going to guarantee this for everybody because it just definitively makes everybody's lives better. We just do it because we can. And so this is kind of the march of civilization as we move forward and as we gain more abundance with these different things, that we just collectively decide to do these great things for each other just because we can. And so that, I think, is kind of the way that I would frame what a human right is. I think that is a very like plain, like vague enough, but still like understandable way of thinking about it. But I'd love to hear your response and kind of what this whole panel came up with.
Yeah, we're all set with that. What you're describing is, with all respect and politeness, that's kind of a trap that some of our panels fell into also, and we had to kind of work our way out of the quicksand a couple of times on that, because what you're describing is what we in our panels called civil rights, that are granted by some authority to certain people under certain times, certain conditions, as distinct from so-called natural rights or fundamental rights, which supposedly everybody on earth possesses, like a right to life and maybe right to die and some other things. And that was a further extent of our group's debate as to which rights, if any, are natural, that belong to everybody all over the planet at all times of history, regardless of where or how you choose to live, versus civil rights, which are only optionally agreed to by members of a civil society under certain conditions. So which are which? And there's some people say that, hey, all rights are natural. We all have a right to everything. So, I see it on Twitter all the time. Kamala Harris says, that such and such is a human right, and therefore we all have to have it. Well, what you're describing as human rights is actually a subset of rights, right, as we consider it. It's the civil rights portion, and that's a very important element to consider. But that definition leaves out the possibility of natural rights. Now, as to natural rights, that again was another key question, which I don't know if we want to go into another day or not, but that could, because that's a whole other can of worms on that, because one of our panel, our main panel, our blue panel, the one which went all the way through, they initially concluded, and they held that position for a long time, that there are no natural rights at all. Mm-hmm. And the reason that they concluded that, and I'm not sure at this point that the reasoning is entirely valid. We're still thinking more about that. But the reasoning that they came up with is that every right that you could possibly claim as a natural fundamental right, up to and including the right of life, can be legitimately abridged by society under certain conditions. For example, if you're a convicted criminal, you committed 18,000 murders, and they fit, okay, this guy's committed 18,000 murders, he's convicted over and over, he's basically waived his right to life. We can go ahead and kill him. Now, maybe, you believe in capital punishment and maybe you don't, or certain conditions or whatever. But at least the theory, the people who do believe that it's appropriate under certain conditions to terminate somebody's life because of excessive criminal activity, they're saying that, okay, this guy's right to life can be abridged by society. And if it could be abridged by society, then it's not really a natural right. It's a matter of society to decide one way or another whether this guy has a right to live. And if that's the case, then it becomes a civil right. Now, that's what the other group originally concluded, that every single right that you could name can be abridged by society under certain conditions. And if so, they're all civil rights. Well, we thought about that more later on, and the panelists figured, that may not be an entirely valid line of reasoning. That in fact, it's possible that you do have certain natural rights including the right to life and a few others, the right to propagate your species and some others, um, the right to property that you personally create and some others. And that if that right is ever taken away from you for some reason, then it must be something that you did bad. It's something that you did to basically waive your right. So if you're waiving the right, it doesn't mean that you didn't have the right to start with, is that you waived it. So that is a whole question of, do we have any natural rights or not, and if so, which rights are natural and which rights are civil? So that's a whole big discussion, and we're not entirely sure we nailed that down. We took our best effort, but before we can even address that, we had to address the more fundamental question: well, what is a right generally that you can have these two possible branches of? So the current definition, I'll start from the end and basically say what we ended up with, we can go over some of the preliminaries if you want, but we ultimately ended up with that a right is the freedom to take a certain action or to receive or enjoy a certain benefit. We like that definition mostly. We still have a hang up about it because the first word in the definition is the word freedom. And that is also ambiguous. And we noted that, and I was reading the notes just today when we were having our debates in 1997 on this, and we went through a whole bunch of candidates to end up with that one. And we noted at the time, it's in the record, that we noted, hey, this is a maybe good definition, but it relies a lot on the term freedom, which is also ambiguous, and we might have to define that, and then it becomes a possible circular definition again, where we define A based on B, but you're defining B based on A, and you're not really getting a sense. If I'm from the planet Skyron, the galaxy of Andromeda, and I come here and I'm observing you guys on this planet Earth, and I hear you guys talking about rights, and I know these other terms like benefit and action and enjoy and receive, but I don't know what rights are, I don't know what privileges are, and I don't know what freedoms are. Can you define those for me? And I still haven't gotten. And we went through Oxford English Dictionary. We went through a bunch of law dictionaries. We went through a bunch of resources as well as our own minds, and we still it's unclear. So if we can synthesize something out of our discussion that might improve our model, we're very receptive. But we feel that it is important to nail down this definition of a right before we can even consider those other elements about natural rights and civil rights and responsibilities and waivers and we need a core definition, something that covers the entire umbrella in one or two short phrases. And we've taken stab at that, but again, we're not entirely sure that we nailed it.
This is so. I feel like I'm speed running through like understanding the nature of rights and freedom, like going through months of research in just like minutes. This is really cool. Yeah. So it's a really interesting point. I think you had a really good point about like the categorization aspect, that like, well, human rights, natural rights, civil rights, like what, like how do we categorize and sort these things? Like, and I have in the past thought about like the concept of a natural right doesn't make any sense to me, because even right after you're born, somebody could kill you, and that, boom, right? And then everything else that you might call a right has also ended, right? But then you introduce this idea of like waiving your rights, and it's like, okay, so how does that compare to a privilege, right? Like, and it's like, and it's a good question of like, okay, is it about like what counts as waiving your right? Like, it's almost another kind of like, there's a gray area there. Like, yes, you can explicitly state I am waiving my right to whatever, but like, can you also waive your right through certain actions? And then at that point, yes, is it waiving your right, or is it just like it's more of a privilege because it's set up ahead of, the expectations are set up ahead of time to take it away from you, or how those expectations set? And so this, you've got a really good point that like this does get very, very fuzzy very, very quickly.
It's a very tricky area, and it's one of those areas I like to say that rights are like pornography. You may not be able to define it, but you know what it is when you see it.
Right.
But that even that doesn't hold up because again, in the poll you were describing it, the poll that you posted the other day, that voting rights were either a right or a privilege. Well, we looked at that in our evaluation too. A lot of the candidate definitions that were suggested for right contain the word privilege in them. One person said rights are a bundle of basic privileges. Well, that didn't really help us very much, because they basically synonymized rights and privileges. Whereas another panel, and actually I think it was someone in Twitter last year pointed out that the word privilege comes from the French, meaning private law, meaning a law that pertains to some people but not others. So that kind of, if we can rely on that, that's an if, but that would be similar, that would be in line with what our group considers to be called civil rights, the ones that are optionally agreed to or conditionally agreed to by members of a civil society, versus any rights which we might happen to have naturally or fundamentally. So if that is true, then I was basically reading your poll as when you use the term privilege, that you were using it in that respect of what we would call civil rights, and that you said, and that the other option of right would be more in line of what we call natural rights. Was that the distinction that you were making between right and privilege? Where were you going with that?
Yeah, I was getting at like this specific thing of like we say the right to vote all the time, but then we take it away from people in even like very regular circumstances like felony convictions, and that's kind of the big one for me. And so it's like, okay, well, if it can be taken away from you, is it really a right? Like regardless, and it's like it's also this like, is it like it may be codified as a right and written in as a right in whatever law, but then also but then taken away from you against what the law says, like illegally taken away from you, maybe if it's unconstitutional. And so it's and so I was really trying to get at this thing of like it's supposed to be a right, but in practice it's a privilege, is kind of the way. And so that's what I was like, I was trying to like get under people's skin on that in between of like, are you going to answer based on what it's supposed to be or what it is in reality? But you've highlighted that it's even more complex than that.
Yeah. And then just as you said just now, that's another element too of the discussion to consider. Well, what is it versus what should it be, and the question, what is a right, can be broken down that way. What is a right versus what should be a right? And I believe I read a note, a response from you on Twitter the other day. We'll mention it for the record now, that you made a very good point, that the definition of right may have changed over time. That it meant something, a couple of centuries ago, more along the lines of natural rights, which you read Jefferson talk about in the Declaration of Independence. We have natural right to this, we have natural right to that. And then more recently, you said, and I agree, that it appears to be a lot more. Everything is is basically in the realm of civil rights, because even voting and right to life and right to immigrate, right to have a child, right to abort a child, a bunch of rights that people claim are civil. Claim are natural, rather, are being taken away, or they're attempting to take them away by various governmental entities. And is that right or wrong, good or bad? We're not sure. That's part of the debate. But again, we felt that we need to have a single definition that encompasses all those possibilities somehow. Were we correct? Did we need a definition? Well, we thought so. And as part of my research here for our chat today, we came up with definitions for a bunch of other concepts too: government, treason, marriage, crossing a border with military force, economy, a few other things, public interest. we had to define what these expressions meant, at least as we were going to be using them, so that we could use those expressions later on. And every time we use them in our literature, we could say, okay, when we use this expression, we mean that thing. And that's what we tried to do with the expression right. We're still not sure entirely if we've nailed it down.
Yeah, definitely. And while I have, I always have a copy of the Constitution available because
Yeah, me too.
people bring it up all the time, especially as a congressional candidate. I've spent a lot more time looking at this document in the last year than I have in the whole rest of my life by like tenfold. So
I hope
let
you
me.
won't be offended, but our group proposes a few modifications to the Constitution here and there.
Oh no,
We're
trust
not
me, I've got
entirely happy with that document as it currently exists, but
No, yeah, and I'm not looking to this as like a guide for how everything should be done or whatever, but just to give people an example, right? So to read the exact language of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, semicolon, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to peacefully or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, comma, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Actually, I'm going to throw that in the chat. So that's the First Amendment, and the other amendments mostly kind of follow that similar format. But if we skip forward to I really like the 14th Amendment. It's one of my favorites. The Equal Protections Clause. So Section 1: all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, semicolon, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So that's the 14th Amendment. So that was 1860s, or hang on, I should have the date right here. Ratified 1868. And then if we go closer to the end, so let's go for Amendment 26 in 1964 is ratified. The right of citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for president or vice president, or electors for president or vice president, or for senator or representative in Congress, shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state by reason of failure to pay poll tax or other tax. So this is almost implying that you can abridge the right, but just not for that reason.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's interesting to see how it's evolved just in this document.
I also note with interest when you were talking about the First Amendment there that, and I don't think that I ever really picked up on that nuance before, but now I do. That they mention a couple of things that are freedoms and a couple of other things that are rights. And are they saying that rights and freedoms are two different things, or were they just being clumsy with their use of synonyms or something else? That's kind of a fuzzy element. I might want to read more into that and see if I can find, or maybe in the historical literature, were they actually going anywhere with that semantic distinction, or was it just that's the words they came up with and they were not? So I'm not sure about that, and I'd like to look into that, or maybe
Yeah, I don't know that I have a ton of extra context that I can add. I know that I assume Madison probably wrote whole books on this, but
yeah.
But it is just so interesting because we tend to shorten these phrases and say the freedom of speech, right? The freedom of the press, which I say that all the time. It's part of my platform when I talk about separating press and or cleanly defining what counts as press. But that's not what the actual language is in the Constitution. Again, I'm not praising the Constitution as this end-all be-all, but just recognizing that as a person running for Congress and thinking about the legislation that is like lawful and constitutional that I can enact, I have to think about these particular wordings. So it's just an interesting thing to like point out and think about how it's like each of these amendments are about a century apart, and so we're about another half century away from the last one now, a little bit more than that. And so yeah, just thinking about how it just has continued to change. But it is a very fascinating discussion because it is just formatted so differently in each of these different amendments.
Oh, and again, when you get into the different dictionaries, we'd be amazed. We think, oh, you want to know what something means? You want to know the definition of something? Well, you look it up in the dictionary. Boom, you're done. Well, for a lot of things, maybe, but not for this one. It turned out to be non-trivial, and I kind of like to if you don't mind, I don't need to read all our candidates' definitions, but if I do nothing else, I want to show off this card here.
Yeah, hold it nice and close. Hold it steady. Let it focus. It's still trying to focus on your face. Oh, there we go. All right.
There you go. All
cool.
right. Now
There's
you
some
can
tiny
see.
little
Pretty
writing
small
there.
print, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
All these notes, I wrote these up in 1997. So, and these are all when I went to the library and I looked at the Oxford English Dictionary. Okay, it's supposed to be our total authority on the English language, and boy, were they all over the map. Long there are 9 pages of definition pertaining to right. And can you see this?
9 pages.
It says 9P in OED. That means 9 pages of the Oxford English Dictionary are devoted to the one word right. So that did not make my job any easier.
Right.
But I at least want to show this off, because the very fact that I found it in my notes today that I had written these notes on this card and where the card was. So I was able to produce this card and show it off for you today. And I'm kind of jazzed by it.
Proud,
it seems to me you got to be pretty well organized in order to compile an Answers to Everything kind of document, and this kind of shows me off. So anyway, there's that. But the actual notes that are on here, they don't really add anything. It's just long and it's convoluted and in its various variations. So we went to the law dictionaries. We had 3 of them here.
Yeah, looking at historical precedents and like Supreme Court cases and like and looking at other countries, right? Like I get so focused on the U.S. because I'm campaigning, but I mean like this is a global conversation. This is right. We can't be America centric here.
Exactly right. It needs to be, and not only does it not need to be should not be America centric, but it also should not be now centric. It should be something that applies everywhere over time, past, future, and now. Global in terms of time as well as geography. Here, I found it, the 3 law dictionaries, and they're all short, but they're big. From the Dictionary of International and Comparative Law, human rights are basic principles which are purported to protect people. That doesn't really tell us much. From Ballantyne's.
Yeah, principle. Like, what is, like, right? What does principle mean in that
it doesn't really help. Ballantyne's. A right is that to which a person has a just and valid claim, whether it is land, a thing, or a privilege of doing something. So there you go.
Wait, so now they're using privilege.
The law dictionary puts privilege as part of the definition of a right. Are they correct? We don't know. And Black's Law Dictionary, which seems to be, the preeminent authority. They even mentioned that in LA Law, that you got to have Black's Law Dictionary. And what they did, I said they were all short, but Black's was not. So I don't know if you want me to go through all of these. There were several attempts, and nothing really good. And it talked about different kinds. It talked about 4 different kinds of rights. meaning natural rights, civil rights, political rights, and personal rights. And they have a fairly short description for each of them, but no one thing which covers the entire set. So, and those are from law dictionaries. And I went to Oxford English Dictionary, and none of these things is helping. So, our group gave ourselves a non-trivial task, and again, to this date, that was 24 years ago that we looked at this stuff, and we still to this date are not sure that we completely succeeded. So there's
I
that.
wonder what the United Nations definition of a right is.
Well, funny thing about that, um, I believe it was 1948 that they put together a
Right.
so-called Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they still go
Yeah.
by that today. And to my immediate recollection, please somebody check me, or I'll check myself later. But I do not believe that document ever defined a right anywhere. What they did is they listed all these things that are universal human rights according to them, but they didn't have a set definition that would encompass all of these. And it would be nice if we had a set definition that would encompass all these. Then we can look at, well, does this particular thing qualify as a right under this definition, or does it qualify as something else under some other or not? But without a set definition, something that applies to all types of rights in all places of the world at all times of history, we can't seem to get a single definition of this. So we're trying, but
Yeah, I've got it pulled up here. So I agree that the kind of the post World War II, certainly a lot of progress is made. Still a bit of a mixed bag. We see some negative consequences of that still today, particularly in the Middle East. But what are human rights? So this is from UN.org. Human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Human rights include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and many more. Everyone is entitled to these rights without discrimination. So it uses the word rights in the definition of human rights all the time. So, which one supersedes the other? I can't even tell.
and besides that, they're talking about human rights. They're not really defining rights. They're defining
Yeah,
human
yeah,
rights.
they're defining human rights.
And their definition of human rights again is conversely, it's in line with what our group calls natural rights. Those rights which, if they exist at all, are inherent in all human beings at all places and times, regardless of where or how they choose to live. Freedom of life, freedom from slavery, the things that you mentioned, they consider to be human rights, what we would call natural rights in our group. But it leaves out, it doesn't even apparently talk about there the subset of civil rights, the ones that say, well, you have a right to vote in this jurisdiction if you are age 18, or if you have a primary school diploma, or something else. You have a right to be married under certain conditions. You have a right to have sex under certain conditions. You have a right to join the military. You have a right to join to work at a job under certain conditions. Blah 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 blah. All these things on and on. Right of way, speed limits. These are all civil rights that vary from one jurisdiction to another and from one time period to another. And I wish, our group wishes, that there was one single concise definition which would encompass all of those things, the civil rights, and also the natural or human rights that are enumerated in the UN document that you were just reading from. So I wish, we tried. We may have to give it some further thought.
Yeah, for sure. That's I actually kind of want to swing back around because you had said so. Let's understand the scope of the goal, actually. So for your group, the goal was to come up with in the all-encompassing umbrella term right on its own that encompasses all these other categories of rights that
Right.
is consistent across time from past to future. That is the goal.
That is the goal. We felt that we cannot address all those subsidiary questions about rights unless we had a firm idea to start with of what the heck we're talking about. So yes, that is the goal exactly.
Yeah, oh gosh, it is a bit circular because you do kind of have to have at least some understanding of what comes underneath it to be able to form that. And so thinking about like, because I really am on this thing about I do kind of buy the argument that nobody has natural rights. That it's not a thing that exists because it can always be taken away from you by somebody killing you. That is always possible. And so I really do see it in the vein when I think about rights. I really do see it in the vein of like the interactions of society. So I do think more in line with civil rights. But so then, all right, so we've got civil rights, human rights. You said there was personal rights was in there, which I'm trying to understand the difference between personal rights and human rights, and then also like using the word freedom and like what preposition you use after the word freedom. So freedom to, freedom from, freedom of, and trying to like navigate that. So I will say personally, I think I'm more leaning toward thinking about the kind of civil rights aspect of like what society or what the state guarantees or doesn't guarantee for you, or what it can or cannot take away from you, or what it is or is not allowed to take away from you at least. And I think that for me is more the focus because I just don't see this kind of other aspect of it as really being very real. But that's my opinion, and of course I haven't been part of these long discussions for 24 years like you and your colleagues have.
And it's been a mental trip, boy. Anyway, I got a couple of responses there on first when you noted that you tend to be in favor of the argument that there are no natural rights, notwithstanding the United Nations statement. And I'll just offer for your consideration, there is another argument that our panels came up with for why there allegedly are no natural rights. And one of them was that, yeah, they can all be abridged. But a second argument that they come up with is that any right must have a source, right? Has to have come from somewhere or something or someone. It doesn't just spring into existence, does it? And if there are any natural rights, what is their source? Where did they come from? And we asked ourselves that question. That's a separate question that we asked her. Where do rights come from? Which we thought we couldn't answer unless we figured out what rights are. But that was a separate question that we addressed. Where do rights come from? And when it comes to natural rights, if we could not identify a clear and obvious source of natural rights, then maybe natural rights don't exist at all. And we looked at different candidates. We looked at nature. We looked at God. We looked at the universe. We looked at a few different things. And of course, we cannot establish a global or even national consensus among our people as to whether God exists or not, and what is the nature of the universe. They can't even agree how old the universe is. There are some people think we live on a flat Earth that's only 6,000 years old. We can't really achieve a consensus among these different belief systems, so we can't try. We have to look and see, well, what is clearly identifiable, what is clearly obvious, and we could not identify a clear and obvious source for natural rights. And so we think, okay, well, if that's the case, maybe they don't exist at all. So that's an argument they may wish to consider to help bolster your current position that there are no natural rights is that, well, maybe there's, there's no source, so maybe there's no natural rights.
Well, I would actually call that argument into question because I would say, well, why do all rights need a source? Right? I would say civil rights, yeah, do need a source, but to me, if I think of natural rights, like you said, it doesn't just spring up out of nowhere, but like, why not?
Well, we looked at that too, and we considered that later on, and the counter argument to that is, well, the universe appeared to spring into existence out of nothing, and so whatever is the source of the universe is basically the source of the natural rights, if there are any. So maybe they did spring into existence out of nowhere, and so yeah, that is a very important counter argument to consider.
Yeah,
True,
but
right?
it does feel like a very human. I will say rights do feel like a very human thing though. Like they don't really seem to extend beyond humans unless the source is from humans, right? So if we were to give like animal rights, right? But that is coming from humans. That is not something that animals organize for themselves. So I think that is another reason that I feel that rights are a thing that is created by humans because we decided that we wanted to have them, rather than right. And why there are no natural rights, because if there were natural rights, then they would apply to more than just humans. but
Yes.
but I don't see, I can't think of any rights that other living beings have that aren't directly sourced from humans.
Well, that's also an important point that we also looked at, and I'm very glad that you brought that up. When it comes to so-called animal rights, we asked ourselves that question too: do animals have rights? If so, where do they come from? And the argument followed kind of parallel lines with the discussion about human rights. That maybe there are some rights, such as the right to life, which are natural. They apply to everybody, including all animals. Maybe you have rights to territory. Maybe you have rights to mate. You have rights to propagate as a species. That seems to be a natural right. But on the other hand, we also considered, well, okay, that may be a right that came from nature because it happens all the
Mm-hmm.
time. There also happens to be a right of nature for larger animals to eat smaller animals because that happens all the time too. And just try to make it stop happening if you can. So, but on the other hand, those so-called natural rights, they don't exist all the time because even nature dictates that your right to life, if you have one, has a limited duration.
Mm-hmm.
So it does not exist at all times, not for you, and not for any of these animals, not the ones who are preyed upon or the predator species. They all die sooner or later, and so any right to life that they have from nature is limited in duration. So if that's the case, is nature really giving them? Well, I guess you could say that nature is giving them a temporary right, whatever that means. It's like your driver's license expiring at a certain date and you got to get it renewed, something like that, maybe. Or something expires at a certain point, you can't do it anymore, so maybe. But that's an additional discussion too, and that's important. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, and you mentioned the right to procreate, but I mean there are plenty of species that are born infertile, right? And so okay, well then do they still have that right? Like, I mean, even like, let's just limit the scope to humans. Like, I personally believe that we should never forcibly take away somebody's physical ability to procreate, and for any reason. But that is more about like society and the state, because that is a thing we did for a long time. Eugenics was a whole thing. We saw what that turned into. That's kind of why we've really said, like, all right, no more. But I mean, but for people who struggle with infertility, It's like right now we don't really have the medicine to restore fertility to people who were born infertile, or at least in most cases we don't, so far as I'm aware. Maybe we will someday. We probably will someday. But for now, I mean, do those folks really have the right to procreate in the same way that somebody who was born fertile? I think that's a valid question.
Well, and I guess that a possible, at least partial answer to that question, and again, this is an area, it's a deep area, and it's a complex area. It's not as easy as looking up in the dictionary as we might have liked. Maybe someday it will be, but in the meantime, it's complex, and it might be argued as a partial answer that these natural rights apply to specimens of a species generally, but there can be individual exceptions. Even if somebody has a right, a natural right to life, even if that's for a specified time, well, if you happen to get a baby that happens to be stillborn, does somebody or something take away that baby's right to at least some limited lifespan? I guess we can't really say that. And maybe it's just that there are individual anomalies to everything. Some people, you might say that people have a right to two working arms, but some people are born with only one arm or no arms. They have various other birth defects. Could we say that their rights were denied? I don't know, maybe, but I think more likely it's just that the right applies generally, the right to life generally, and the right to propagate generally appears to exist. And as we started to describe before, animals seem to respect the rights of other animals, at least up to a degree, at least among specimens of their own species. They don't care about the smaller prey species that they want to eat up in order to live. I mean, they do what they do. Sharks do what they do. Tigers do what they do. But at least within a clan, a colony, a group of animals, there is some, at least in some species, there is a recognition of space and duty, especially among the bees and termites and some of these insect species who have very complex social constructs. They basically work around each other for the good of the colony. So
Some of them even sacrifice themselves for the good of the colony, and that
happens too. Yeah, that happens too. So but when it comes to animal rights, you said, well, maybe animals don't have rights, or if they do, they all came from humans. Well, maybe not. We look. I mentioned the tiger. I'm very heavily into tiger preservation, and the wolf and the elephant, and a lot of these other species that are being decimated by trophy hunters. Answers to Everything is a big problem with that, and I think it maybe could be argued that those animals have some right to life, and maybe it's a natural right to life because they got that life from nature. We didn't give them that life; they got it from themselves, from their parents, from their natural world. So it's just a matter of whether their natural right to life, if they have it, is being abridged by humans, and if so, is the abridgment legitimate or not? And maybe it's some of each, and so. That's part of the question to be considered too.
Yeah, from the perspective of the animal, whether it's a trophy hunter or somebody, trying to get their dinner, it's no different from the perspective of the animal, right? They're being killed either way, and so
they don't care why, right?
Yeah. And it's like okay, so does that justify trophy hunting? I mean, like I'm against trophy hunting. I mean, I know there's this thing where it's like they use the funds from it for preservation in some countries. That's like a thing that happens. Are you aware of this, or?
I hadn't heard that. No, I don't think.
Yeah, so trophy hunting. This isn't everywhere. In some countries that have the programs well set up, they'll like charge somebody $10 million to like hunt down a particularly aggressive rhino or elephant or whatever it is. But then they will put all of that money into preservation for that animal. And so there's this kind of utilitarian argument that like, yes, you did lose this one elephant, but but you've also in the process then saved 100 other elephants. And so
I don't think that I heard about that. That's a tricky question.
And again, it's not in all cases.
Big one for the team. Ouch. Wow, I don't know about that.
In some of those countries where it is implemented well, it works. It's not everywhere, but sometimes it does work out. And so again, it's this. I think that this gets into an argument about like one of the things that I say is that one of the themes of the 20th century is that we learned that pure utilitarianism is not good for humanity. And like I think of eugenics as the prime example of like thinking about trying to like control who should and should not, can and cannot breed or procreate, like is a major slippery slope that causes really big problems, and it ultimately is like, all right, this pure utilitarianism is not the answer, and that there needs to be a certain level of like individual compassion for people, including people you've never met, and so that like I think that also plays into this of thinking about like, okay, our rights maybe in some capacity, I wouldn't say this is the whole definition, but in some capacity, a way to check utilitarianism, maybe in a civilized society, of ensuring that we don't go too far. I mean, and this makes me also think about like with voting science, right? Like to get the most accurate results, you actually need a mix of more utilitarian methods, like scoring cardinal methods, but you won't by kind of checking it with a little bit of majority, right? So like with star voting having the automatic runoff, or in Smith's score having the restricting it to the Smith set, which is kind of a majority requirement in a way, or there's some other hybrid methods out there that like those are the methods that tend to produce the most accurate results. And so I mean that just is something that ties in with my mind about like, well, typically in most categories, most topics, most issues, some kind of hybrid or compromise approach is usually ends up being the best, and having this black and white thinking isn't the way to think about it. So maybe that applies to rights generally, like you were saying. Maybe rights can have exceptions and still be rights, which I think is kind of the thing that I hadn't really considered before. Of like, before I think I did have this black and white thing. Before we had this conversation, that like a right is supposed to be this black and white thing that we strive toward, and like hopefully we can achieve someday, and hopefully someday we will. But maybe there is a way to compromise it, and it's always this issue of like ensuring that the compromises are done correctly, that it's not like, oh, you're just excluding black people from the right to vote. Like, that's not the right way to compromise on the right to vote. Maybe there's a different way to compromise on it. And so, yeah, my mind's just kind of great. Like I'm just kind of working through all of this stuff.
That's where it gets tricky, and that's why this discussion, the general discussion about rights and the specific discussion of the definition of a right, that's why it's important, because depending on what that definition happens to be, and depending on what some of these other answers are that relate to rights and responsibilities and other related issues, depending on what those answers are, you can manage to derive different kinds of conclusions that can have big different effects. And I'm glad, in particular, you mentioned about utilitarianism. Our group looked at that too, and we agree with you that utilitarianism has its limits, and it ties in, and we talked about that on our website. Also, that it ties in with the so-called objectivism, which basically holds the greatest good for the greatest number. And we reject that argument because under that argument, and it kind of ties in with what you're saying, that a million white people can agree that they have the right to lynch one black person, and even though it's 1,000,000 to 1 vote, it's still wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So objectivism can't really work in that sense. It can't be the greatest good for the greatest number, 1,000,000 to 1. No, it's still wrong. Utilitarianism, no, it can still be wrong sometimes, depending on how you apply it. But then people apply it different ways, and that ties into another one, another similar example of human slavery. For centuries, you had a lot of white people in southern United States claiming that they had a right to own slaves. Did they? They said, some of them said they had a natural right to own slaves because they were white and the other people were black, or because they were American and the other people were from a foreign continent, or for some other reason. But they claimed divine right, or at least a civil right, and other people came along and said, no, you don't have that right, and there was a big fuss and bother about it, and a big war, and the debate continues to this day. You still have a lot of privileged, entitled white people claiming that they deserve all these benefits of society, including the right to vote, and that these other people, as they like to sometimes refer to them, do not have the same levels of rights or privileges, and they come to these conclusions through these different definitions of what a right is, or what different kinds of rights are, or what the sources of rights are, and so it's an important discussion, even though it's a tough one, and it's going to be we think it's hard to come up with arguments that will satisfy all these people about, no, you can't lynch these people, no, you cannot enslave these people, no, you can't hunt tigers and wolves and elephants for sport or trophies, and some of these other things that people claim they have a right to do or to have that actually end up injuring other people. We need some set of arguments that will convince these people, or at least the general world around them, that they're all wet. And it's hard to come up with those arguments unless we come up with solid definitions that everybody can agree with as a starting point. That's a big issue that we confronted with Answers to Everything generally, not for just this topic as rights, but for everything. There are so many different opinions out there about how different things ought to be. And we have arguments all the time. We have civil wars, we have political debates, we have bar fights, broken up marriages, on and on, because people, they have these different perspectives, and they can't or won't communicate together. Well, one reason that they can't or won't communicate together is because they don't have a common starting point. They need to have at least one thing, maybe a few things that they all agree on as a starting point. Establish where you agree, and then figure out where and why you begin to disagree. And that's what Answers to Everything did. We spent over a quarter century doing just that, starting out with the basic principles that we felt that everybody could agree on, and then step by step, we looked at every single spot where people started to disagree about anything, and we looked at why.
Yeah,
and it's been a big trip.
Yeah, it's and a specific thing that you had mentioned is like the way that people justified slavery. And this is like a really interesting thing. Again, looking at the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 9, the first clause, it says it's very carefully worded here. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. But a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. So this is saying slavery is going to be legal until 20 years from now. And not only that, if we then go down to Article 5, which describes the amendment process, it says, so the Congress, whenever 2/3 shall propose amendments, Parts of this Constitution ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article. So they double protected slavery in the Constitution, but only for 20 years. And the way I interpret that is the founding fathers, who pretty much all owned slaves, knew that slavery was wrong. They knew that it was going to become illegal at some point, but they didn't want it to happen while they were still around. And so to me, that tells me that that they knew that slavery was wrong, but that they chose to they chose to kind of codify it in this weird way. Like I said, they worded it very carefully. They never said indentured servant or slave. They were very careful about it. They were trying to kind of tiptoe around the issue and trying to avoid saying the quiet part out loud. Because they wanted to continue doing what they were doing and have these kind of external justifications, but they kind of still knew deep down that it wasn't wrong what they were doing it anyway.
That may be at least part of it, and maybe the entirety of it. I'm going to suggest an alternative explanation.
Okay.
And I don't know, it wasn't there, but it sounds as though, and based on other readings, that I've made about the Declaration of Independence also, that you had some founding fathers that were definitely into slaveholding, and some other founding fathers that were not, and that actually opposed it. And it sounds more like a political expediency more than anything else. You're trying to get this Constitution agreed upon and ratified, and they were not going to get it done if they put in a clause that said no slavery immediately forever. And they were not going to get it ratified if we say, sure, hold slaves anywhere, anytime, forever. They weren't going to get it ratified either way. They needed some kind of compromise to say, okay, well, we can have slavery, but for a limited time only. And that appeared to have worked.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a CGP Grey. He makes great YouTube videos. He calls it a compromise institution, because that's all it is. It's just a bunch of compromises. And so that's interesting. Yeah, no, that's an interesting interpretation. I can see that. Yeah, but
and now that you mentioned that's a big reason why I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of other things in the Constitution that the Answers to Everything has a few, shall we say, quibbles with, which in many cases were probably also the result of political compromise. Well, we got to do something just to get this moving. So, all right, we'll do it this way. We don't really like it, but at least it gets everybody agreeing on the document. But if they had explored further or had more or better foresight, they might have figured out that there are other ways to do it. Like having 3 houses of Congress instead of 2, and some other things that that they could have done. They went with the Electoral College instead, and some other things that we have a hang up with. So it's a compromise institution, correct? We agree, and we're hoping to our group is to take this opportunity or create an opportunity to make some wholesale changes, not only in other things that we do, but in that constitutional document as well.
Yeah, and always thinking about, there are so many people trying to push for the 28th Amendment in so many ways. Obviously, it's very politically difficult right now. I will say, I think I've come up with a possible 28th Amendment that I think might actually be legally viable. And I don't have the exact language of it down, but something along the lines of, well, no, I guess this is, getting the wording right. Right to privacy of thought. Or basically saying that you cannot be convicted of a crime based on private thoughts or something along those lines, right? So trying to prevent thought crime here, and I, to me, this is relevant because so many of our congressional members are, I think, the 51st oldest senator just turned 65. So we have a Congress filled with people who still live in the 20th century, is that how I like to put it. But I'm looking at kind of the bleeding edge in technology. I'm looking at like brain-machine interfaces and like Neuralink that Elon Musk is working on, and I mean even just thinking about like the way that social media basically reads our minds based off the way that our thumb touches the screen. It's pretty insane.
Yeah.
And so I definitely want to like I think the longer we wait to codify that, the harder it's going to be. And so I think that something that's very simple and very short, that I think we could get a pretty diverse coalition of people behind, might actually be able to get it passed and ratified potentially.
All right. Well, it's funny that you mentioned that too, because the Answers to Everything group has looked at that also. We looked at everything, and yeah, we asked ourselves only fairly recently. Actually, it's only a couple of years ago. Um, should we have an equal rights amendment in the U.S. Constitution? And the big hangup that our group had with all the proposals that we had seen up to that point is that the amendments seem to focus on women and not everybody else, as though everybody else doesn't have the equal rights. Or if they do, then they're going to have to be codified in the Constitution with additional amendments. And I hate to go through that. I mean, we're having such trouble with the present one. Do we want to go through this? And it's taken 50 years, and it hasn't been done yet. You want to go through that process again with these other groups? No. So we came up with a draft phraseology. Specific language probably should be along the lines of, quote, all the rights which are extended in this Constitution and all its amendments shall apply in full force to all blank, comma, regardless of blank. And we were thinking regardless here in the paragraph above, so we feel that such an ERA should not be only about women, although women certainly may and should be specified in it. Rather, it should be about all segments of our society and should specify all gender identities, all sexual orientations, all religious affiliations, all racial and ethnic backgrounds, and possibly other categories as well. Got a note here, we were tempted to include geographical locations, chronological ages, left and right-handed, body shapes and sizes, and others, but we didn't want to go overboard. As long as you get the main idea across that everybody is and should be protected. So yeah, that's our take on that, and we feel, just as you were saying, that if we come up with a simple but more inclusive phrasing, similar or identical to that one, I think we have a lot better chance of getting that finally enacted and getting that debate put to bed, and then we can start focusing on other things. So there's
Yeah,
that.
there's I had another guest on a couple months ago, Paul Sisler, and he wrote a book, and he was like, it was like 3 constitutional amendments, and like the first one was basically what you just said. He had a full wording for it, and I suggested adding. He like listed sex, sexual orientation, gender, blah blah blah, and I suggested adding onto it or other identity or something, like using the word identity, which is like kind of vague, but it leaves open the possibility of like these kind of future interpretations of human identity. I mean, we've learned a lot, and we've gained a lot of language around the nature of human identity just over the last 25 years. And there's no reason to suspect that that won't continue. And so trying to keep that a little bit open-ended, I think would ultimately be helpful. But I'll tag him. I'll tag him on Twitter for you. I'll send him your way, or send you his way,
Great.
or whatever. I think you might be interested in reading his book.
Okay. First chance we
Yeah.
get. A lot of books to still to read, but
Yeah.
yeah, read a lot already. So
Man,
yeah,
I can't. Oh, I did not expect we were going to spend over an hour just talking about rights. I thought this conversation was going to expand, but man, I didn't realize just how expansive this conversation was.
and there's so much more
Mm-hmm.
to cover. Again, rights, responsibilities, waivers. I mean, there's all kinds of these sub issues. I mean, go on and on. It's but it's a fascinating subject, and it, I really love the mental stimulation of it, and the challenge that we face. That something which seems so simple at first
Mm-hmm.
turned out to be so non-trivial, and Oxford English Dictionary couldn't help. All these law dictionaries couldn't help. What the heck is going on? It's made me wonder, maybe the people who wrote those law dictionaries don't want these things to be so easily identifiable and codifiable. Maybe they made them vague to start with. Lawyers got to do something to make a living, don't they? They make a lot of laws, and they have a lot of fine print and 28-page contracts, and they want to give themselves work to do. Maybe they did it deliberately, or maybe it's just an oversight. We don't know. Not going to speculate, but it sure would be nice. Regardless, in any case, it sure would be nice if we had one summary definition. So we got our thing in there. We got to look again at the word freedom in our current working definition.
Mm-hmm.
It's potentially vague. It's potentially circular. It's particularly funny that they use freedom and rights in the same First Amendment to refer to different things. I'm still curious as to whether there's something in that. So I'm going to check. I'm making a mental note now. I'm going to check into that and see if there's something in there. Maybe Madison, as you mentioned, read in the Federalist Papers. He probably went on. That guy went on and on. Boy, you guys think I've read a lot of words. This just to mention quickly, this blue panel that I mentioned that went through our entire outline of questions. I'm still putting together I'm still finalizing their report, because they finished their first pass a couple of years ago, and we've added and changed some things since then. That report is already over 1,200 pages, and it's 629,515 words, and we're still adding more. And I still got the other panels that we got transcribed from those times, and then put them all together and synthesize, compare and contrast, and synthesize, and so we got lots of literature. So I've been going on and on too. But Madison, he could write a lot too. So we'll have to see. But I'm still a little upset that our report is still smaller than the Bible. I have not yet outwritten the Bible. So
How many words are in the Bible?
762, I think, thousand something.
Oh, you're coming up on it though. You're
So
not
we're
too
getting
far.
closer.
You're
Yeah.
getting there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so funny too, because my website now has probably around it's approaching 20,000 words altogether on it. And I've done some reduction along the way of older stuff and been able to kind of compress it down because I don't have to fill up so much space anymore. But it's like it's so crazy when I meet people like yourself. Like I met another guy who invented this new kind of economic system. He was like, oh yeah, I've written millions of words on it, and he's got this kind of repository on this Google site or whatever. And I'm just like, my goodness, y'all have been at this for so long. Like,
Yeah.
it's like I can't help myself but go back and keep adjusting and amending over and over and over again of what I already have, rather than just pushing forward. But it's so many, and it's so funny to think too. It's like now that's all recorded. There was a point in time where it's like all those words just fade away. They'd be gone. You say them and they're gone. But even this conversation is being recorded. I mean, this is going to be on YouTube for until Google decides that not profiting off of their biggest website anymore just isn't worth it, and they just shut everything down. That'll be quite the day.
Yeah. Cross fingers.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, did you have anything else that was really bugging you that you wanted to bring up or talk about?
There is so much that we could. I mean, maybe we have some other conversations sometime on different subjects or more about rights. There are other of these candidates that I could read into the record, but we probably getting close to taking up enough of people's time. I don't know how much attention span they have for most of these, but I got those. I think we probably pretty much covered a lot of it for now. We can maybe have some other chats another time.
Yeah, for sure. And and I haven't had an opportunity to really like go through your whole highlights page. I did have it pulled up just in case I needed it, but we didn't even get a chance to go into it today.
Yeah,
But
I guess that I better mention before we sign off for anybody who's interested in that. The website is a2e-sum.net or a2e-highlights.net. That's our website. It's about 40 or so pages
and it's in
of just the highlights. Twitter, we're at a2e underscore project. And our new email for the project is a2e.reformproject@gmail.com. If you guys have any, so you can contact us on Twitter. You can contact us by email if you either like what you see on the website or you have any questions about it. The website is just the highlights. Again, it's 40 pages, as compared with 1,200. We did a lot of compressing to get it down to 40 pages. If anybody has any questions on any of that or comments, suggestions, we are entertaining suggestions. The idea of that outline generally, the one thing I guess I want to mention before we sign off is that it's a Christmas tree. It's a living document. We can add ornaments to it all the time as we think of more things to add, or if we spot something that, better thinking or different research comes up, suggests a different solution, a different approach. We are open. It's all the time. It's open to adjustment. So any suggestions or questions anybody has, feel free to let us know. We are receptive to entertaining new ideas, new arguments, and we'll make the conclusions as we'll make the changes to the conclusions as applicable. The important thing is not any one way, not any one party, not any one wing. It's just what is the best way to do everything. That's all we ask. We just want to know the best way to do everything. Is that so much? So we're very receptive to any input that anybody has.
Yeah, and I put the link to the summary page, the highlights page. It's in the description, whatever platform you're on. So Twitter, it should be I put it in the chat too, so it should have just showed up on Twitter. But yeah, the Twitch description, the Facebook description, and the YouTube description, it's in all of those. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Jonathan.
It's been a pleasure.
And I will, like I said, this is gonna live on forever on YouTube. So you can always highlight it or download it or make clips out of it if you really want to. Use whatever you want from it. But I really appreciate having you on, and who knows, maybe we'll swing back around in a couple months or whatever and take a look at something else. But this has been fantastic. So
all right, thanks very much for inviting me. Good luck with the campaign, and yeah, we'll look forward to chatting again soon.